A very warm welcome, everyone, to the Maritime Education Podcast. My name is Barry Sadler, and if you're new to the podcast, as I say, a very warm welcome. I hope you do find some of the topics that we discuss at the Maritime Education Podcast both informative and entertaining. For those of you who are regular listeners, thank you very, very much for returning, and I hope you too find our new subjects engaging. I'd like to talk today about using tugs to berth and unberth ships. I'd like to talk about the different types of tugs available to us, some of the pros and cons of those tugs, and how tugs are used in high-level pilotage to ensure that even the biggest ships in the world are able to arrive and depart from their berths safely, sometimes, of course, in fairly adverse weather conditions. So here we are in November 2025, and like any November really, we're starting to feel that winter is on its way. Low pressure systems are moving across the United Kingdom as the polar front drifts to the south and starts to allow these systems more and more access to United Kingdom coasts. What's complicated things this year in 2025 is the fact that we have had quite a few returning tropical revolving storms that have approached the United Kingdom. Having wreaked havoc in places like the Caribbean or the east coast of the United States, these storms have recurved towards the United Kingdom, and they bring with them very warm, wet air. This warm, wet air almost sits there over the Atlantic, waiting to be picked up by one of our pretty standard low-pressure systems that forms over the northern United States and Canada, and then is driven by the jet stream across the Atlantic towards the United Kingdom. When these depressions or low-pressure systems start to pick up this warm, wet air that's been deposited by these tropical revolving storms, this feeds energy into the low-pressure system, and the result being that we get fairly intense pressure systems coming across with prolonged periods of high winds, lots of rain and precipitation, but hey, this is the UK. But the winds associated with it tend to be more persistent because there's more energy involved in the low pressure system. And particularly this year in November, we have seen many more days where the wind speeds have been above 30 knots than perhaps we've seen in previous years. Now, manoeuvring ships on and off berths is obviously a tricky thing anyway, but add the hazard of nasty wind direction or high wind gusts, and you've really got to be careful. The largest ships that come and go from the port of Southampton will take tugs on a regular basis. In other words, their size and manoeuvrability compared to the room that we have in the port means that as a safety measure, we will have tugs assist us arriving and departing from those berths. In Southampton, we have a very clear, defined guidance on what towage should be taken by large vessels in what we call our port users navigational guidelines. These guidelines are updated regularly through risk assessment, and generally each berth has its own individual risk assessment, and we apply towage to that risk assessment as a measure. The number of tugs is given in the guidance, and therefore both pilots and masters are aware of the towage that they should take on a regular basis. However, when the weather does become a little bit nasty, when the wind speeds are high, then it may be necessary to add extra tugs, or indeed take tugs on ships that don't normally have tugs assigned to them, in order to put in place extra measures to reduce the risk of damage whilst manoeuvring ships in high wind speeds. The tugs that we have, certainly in the port of Southampton, vary in the kind of drive units that they are provided with. They vary in size as well, we have tug companies that can provide very small tugs with a bollard pull of under 10 tons, all the way up to big tug companies in Southampton, which in our case is Svitzer, which can provide tugs with bollard pulls of over 80 tons. This huge range of towage around the port isn't met by a single company, it's met by different companies. And those different companies have different core vessels that they will work with, mainly depending upon the size of the ship, of course. A great big 400-metre container ship would really like to have the 82-ton bollard pull tug on the back end to assist it in berthing. Whereas if you were to take that 82-ton tug and make it fast onto a 100-metre container ship, you'll find that the weight and power in the tug becomes a little bit unwieldy when we're trying to use it to berth or unberth the ship, particularly in windy conditions, which is when these small vessels would normally take tugs. It's worth talking here about the use of large tugs with small ships. Tugs have power within their engines, and of course the drive units will put weight on a tug's line, which allows the tug to pull a ship, or the tug will press itself against the ship and use the power from the engines in order to push a ship to assist with the manoeuvre. It's worth mentioning that not just the power of the tugs puts weight on the tug's line, in that the tug's momentum itself will add weight to the line that the tug is made fast to, or even a tug, if you like, coming alongside a ship. The momentum of the tug, the displacement of the tug, will put weight on a line or put weight on the side of the ship just through the sheer manoeuvring of the tug. And this is always something to bear in mind when we're dealing with small vessels. If the tugs are too big for small vessels, no matter how much you plead with the tug master to use minimum power, the sheer weight of the tug pressing against the line can overcome bow thrusters on small vessels, can move small vessels violently and uncontrollably towards or away from the berth. So the use of really big tugs on small vessels should be avoided, and the selection of the tug for the size of ship is really important. That's why in the Port of Southampton we have such a broad scope of towing capabilities. We have smaller tugs that we use on vessels, let's say, under 150, 140 metres. We have smaller tugs that can provide effective towage with bollard pulls of ranging between 10 and 30 tonnes. This doesn't just mean that the power of the engines is lower, it means that the size of the tug is lower, and therefore the momentum of the tug against the ship or against the line is less, and there's less chance that even in just manoeuvring the tug skipper doesn't put too much weight on the tug's line of a very small vessel. Now, when we talk about this broad range of tugs, we must also bear in mind the propulsion of the tug, the means in which the power is applied to the tug's line or applied to the front or stern of the tug in order to provide the power necessary to handle big ships. As a pilot, we are aware of the limitations of a lot of these drive units, and so I'm just going to go through the basic configurations that are available and something that we take into account when using tugs like this. Now, many of the small tugs in the Port of Southampton are what we would call a conventional screw tug. This means that they will literally have a pair of propellers at the stern, a pair of rudders at the stern, and perhaps a bow thruster at the bow. Now, sometimes the propellers at the aft have caught nozzles to increase the pull. Caught nozzles are basically a nozzle around the propeller which gives the thrust a lot more specific direction and therefore enables the pull that can actually be exerted on the line to be greater. It also stops ropes and things like that going through the propellers quite so easily, as tugs are often operating in environments where there are floating lines kicking around. Now, the first tugs that came into service in the mid 1800s were all conventional screw, and their reason for being was literally that they had very, very little finesse. They were very rugged ships, and basically they were just powerhouses. They relied on brute power rather than any kind of manoeuvrability or finesse in the way the tug itself was handled. Now, this, although the drive units have become a little bit more modern, if you are using a conventional screw tug, this does have some real disadvantages. Now, the advantage is that you get the power very, very quickly. The disadvantage is, of course, that power comes on, and the ability for the tug master to control where that power goes can be very limited. Conventional screw tugs will always tow over the stern, and this has its challenges as well. It has its challenges when we are using the tug at the front of the ship, where the tug has to come in to make fast. It has its challenges when we are moving a ship forward with a tug on the stern, and the tug has to bring itself round and follow the ship to avoid what we call girting. Girting is where a tug has trouble with manoeuvring, and it ends up with the tow line not pulling across the stern, but the tow line being dragged around and pulling athwart ships. Once a tug's tow line is pulling athwart ships, a tug will find it very, very difficult to manoeuvre itself into a safe position, but it's particularly difficult to manoeuvre itself when we talk about having this conventional propeller rudder configuration at the stern of the tug. Therefore, particularly when you've got a conventional tug down aft and you're pulling away from a berth, you must be really mindful of the fact that that tug, when pulling off, has got to manoeuvre itself so that it is almost parallel to the direction that the ship is moving in, so that it doesn't get dragged sideways by any kind of forward momentum of the ship. The same goes for the forward tug, but the forward tug is already pointing in a direction and can bear away from the ship and go in the same direction as the ship with a conventional screw a lot easier. It's normally the after tug that struggles to come around on its tug's line that's acting over the stern when it's just got a twin screw. Tugs lines are gogged to try and minimise the effect of the line being pulled amidships. A gog is the name of either a bracket or a piece of rope that is at the stern of the tug, which attempts to stop the line working its way midships. The gog itself is there so that the line of the pull always goes over the stern of the tug. Now, this will be safer for the tug because it will avoid the tug's line being pulled midships. But of course, where you've got the tug going one way or the other, the line being directly over the propulsion units, so the propellers at the back, the line is at the back gogged down. So basically a lot of the pivot point moves towards the point at which that line is coming into the tug. Yeah, because that's directly above the engines, that again makes the manoeuvrability of these tugs a bit of a challenge. And therefore, if we pull away too fast with one pulling the stern off, this can really be quite hazardous for the after tug, as its manoeuvrability, even with a gog rope there, can be very, very difficult. And as I say, it's got to get itself round to travelling in the same direction as the ship moves ahead. I, as a pilot, always very, very wary of having a conventional screw tug at the stern, and I will give the master of the tug plenty of warning before I drive the engines ahead, in order that he or she can manoeuvre their tug into a safe position for when the ship moves ahead, to avoid being caught either girting, which hopefully wouldn't happen if there was a gog, or literally being dragged stern first, which in itself can have its challenges, of course, because the sterns of conventional tugs tend to be a lot flatter, and therefore when you're pulling it stern first, there's a lot of water that could potentially come over the transom of the tug and cause real problems. Tugs started to get some really quite nice propellers in the early 1900s. So from the 1930s onwards, we started to see Voith Schneider propellers added to tugs. Now, Voith tugs, as they're sometimes called, are basically stern drive tugs with propulsion systems capable of fundamentally pushing the thrust over 360 degrees. Now, these drive systems can either be what we would call an advanced tractor drive or a rotor tug, where these 360 degree thrusters are positioned forward on the ship's bow section, or they can be what we call azimuth stern drive tugs, in which case they would have azimuthing propulsion units, again capable of thrusting through 360 degrees, but these are put at the stern of the ship. Or a more recent development, the reverse stern drive tug, which combines the best of the azimuth stern drive tug and the tractor concept, and positions drives aft, but is designed to operate efficiently in both directions, bow or stern first. Let's break these new tug propulsion systems down a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about an azimuth propeller. An azimuthing propeller is literally a propeller that is capable of being turned through 360 degrees. If you're looking at a diagram of one, you have a shaft coming down with a propeller on it, a little bit like looking at an outboard engine, if you like. But that propeller is capable of turning through 360 degrees, and therefore the thrust can go in all directions. Voith units, as I've just mentioned earlier on, were very revolutionary in the mid-1900s, in that they're a very, very strange looking propeller. Basically, they're a propeller table with propeller blades that look a little bit like rudders hanging down from the turntable. So they don't look like a conventional propeller as we know it. They literally look like a set of rudders hanging down from a turntable. And basically what happens is the turntable swings around, and as the turntable turns, we angle these rudder-like fins in order to give us the thrust through 360 degrees. These Voith units aren't just used on tugs, they're used on large ferries as well. So if you've ever gone on a ferry from the mainland to the Isle of Wight, for instance, chances are that that ferry was propelled by a Voith Schneider unit. Tugs have them. If a tug does have it, it tends to be a tractor tug and tends to have these Voith units towards the front of the tug, and these give the tugs incredibly high manoeuvrability. We call them tractor tugs at the end of the day, and very high manoeuvrability, very, very good bow to ship operations. In other words, the front of the tug can be towards the ship, and the tug gives the pull by, if you like, going astern. If one unit fails, because you've got another unit that's capable of thrusting through 360 degrees, although there won't be the power there, there is a certain amount of redundancy that can be applied there. Now, these kind of tractor systems are expensive. They are mechanically complex, And of course, like anything, particularly the voice Schneider units, they have a high risk of contacting stuff in the water, which may damage them. Now, the other two types of drive that I mentioned there were the azimuth stern drive tugs. This is where you've got an azimuthing unit driving at the stern. Now, azimuth stern drive tugs generally tow bow to bow. So you put a rope over the front of the tug, yep, and this goes to the ship. So fundamentally, you've got the azimuthing props at the back, and this allows you to put a lot of weight on the line by obviously turning those azimuth units round to, if you like, put the tug going astern and apply the weight to the tug's line that way. Equally, they can push bow to the ship, swing the azimuthing units around and push all the power forward. The big restriction that we see in the port of Southampton with azimuth stern drive tugs is that they're a little bit unwieldy if you're trying to make them fast forward. So if you think about it, for an azimuth stern drive tug to make fast on the bow of a ship, it's got to be going astern and at the same time manoeuvring in towards the bow. Now, it can be done, but it increases the risk of an incident happening because the tug is literally going astern, making fast. The manoeuvrability of these tugs when going astern can be limited, and therefore azimuth stern drive tugs really don't like making fast bow to bow, even though they are capable of doing so. If we want to use a tug at the front, we will generally use a tractor tug at the front, one with an azimuth, or the voice Schneider units that are positioned forward. That means that literally the tug can almost pull in both directions. So when it approaches the bow, the units being a little bit further forward make it a lot easier for it to come in. There's a lot more control there in bringing the tug in to make it fast. Reverse stern drive tugs are perhaps the latest concept, and they try to combine the best of azimuth stern drive and tractor concepts. Basically, it does still put azimuth drives aft like an ASD, but it's designed to operate efficiently in both directions. This sometimes means that you end up with a tug with quite an interesting skeg on the bottom of the tug to help with the stability of the tug. These have bi-directional performance. Yeah, in other words, a reverse stern drive tug can give you full power in both directions and in both orientations. So therefore, it makes things much safer using the tug either at the bow or at the stern. You don't need to think about the propulsion. You know, if you get a reverse stern drive tug, he'll be happy operating at the bow or at the stern. It gives you a lot more flexibility. Really, really good stability and predictable handling at high bollard pull is another thing that RSD tugs are renowned for. So when you've got very, very high bollard pulls on, then you've still got, through those 360-degree azimuthing units at the back, a very high degree of control. In other words, even if you're putting a lot of weight on the line, you can still change the direction of that pull very, very easy. And therefore, they are ideal for use in harbours where manoeuvrability and space is limited. Now, they're obviously more expensive than ASD tugs due to the complexity of the hull design, the skeg, etc. And, you know, these are still a relatively new design. In the port of Southampton, we have a tug called the Svizzerellina, which is an RSD tug, and she is excellent. She's probably one of the most versatile tugs that we have. Not to take away from the tractor tugs. The tractor tugs that we have in the port of Southampton are very, very agile as well. It's just that the reverse stern drive tug perhaps has better stability at high bollard pulls. Now, I said to you that the weather was starting to get a little bit breezy here in the port of Southampton. So this always introduces the question as to how many tugs we need to have. Experience of most pilots will indicate when you need to order more tugs. So if you're told by the harbour master that you've got 2 tugs, but you know that the wind speeds that are predicted on the type of ship you're on, that you're going to need more than 2, then you'll propose that to the master and confirm it with the harbour master that you require a 3rd tug. You can use the mathematical way of doing this. Mathematically, what you look at is the surface area of the ship. You then look at the wind speed, and you can do a calculation to ensure that the amount of force that the wind is putting on the side of the ship can be met by the amount of force capable of being generated by your tugs. So if you had, let's say, the two tractor tugs, tractor sisters in the port of Southampton, the Svitzer Bargate and the Svitzer Eston, these are both tractor tugs. They're both 65 tons bollard pull. So together they can produce 130 tons of bollard pull. You've got the engine and the rudder that can produce lift in terms of bollard pull as well. You've got a bow thruster, which is obviously, and a thwartship thruster, which is very, very easy to work out the bollard pull of your thruster. But fundamentally, if we're doing it mathematically, if we need let's say 150 tons of thrust to move a ship sideways, and we've only got tugs that are going to give us bollard pull of 130 tons, then we may wish to consider another tug in order to meet the forces on the side of the ship that we calculate using the surface area. In order to meet those forces, then mathematically we need a 3rd tug to bring it up to enough bollard pull force to meet the ton force of wind that we can calculate for being on the side of the ship. Where we put our tugs is of course very important, in particular with regards to the drives, as we just discussed. Azimuth stern drive tugs are much safer working the stern, whereas reverse stern drive and your tractor tugs are happy either ahead or astern, and this is something that we take into account. It's really important when we talk about working tugs at the bow and the stern that we also think about the configuration of the propulsion of the ship as well. This is particularly important when we are berthing or unberthing cruise ships in very heavy winds. Cruise ships will generally be provided with a lot of power. Cruise ships don't like taking tugs. They like to be able to come and go in most conditions from most ports without the need to take a tug. And therefore, cruise ships are normally provided with a lot of manoeuvring tools. A lot of powerful bow thrusters, and bow thrusters plural. A lot of powerful stern thrusters, or the ability to use the propellers and the rudders to lift the stern by putting high lift rudders behind the propellers, or, as a lot of cruise ships have been doing recently, use of azipods at the stern of the ship, which an azipod is fundamentally like a tug's azimuth stern drive. It's literally propellers dangling down from the back of the ship that are capable of being turned through 360 degrees. A little bit more robust and, of course, a lot more powerful than the azimuthing stern drive of a tug, but nonetheless the same principle. Downwards pointing shaft, propeller that can be turned through 360 degrees. And this is where we need to be careful when we are handling cruise ships in high winds. Cruise ships have huge sides, as I'm sure most of you are aware. Very, very large metre squared surface area of the size of a cruise ship. So if you blow a strong wind right on the beam of a cruise ship, that's going to exert a big force on the side of that cruise ship. When we've got azipods that I've just described on a cruise ship, those azipods are capable of being turned through 360 degrees. So basically we can use almost the full power of the main engines of the ship in the athwartship's direction. In other words, if the wind is blowing hard, the stern is not the problem, because the azipods will generally be able to hold the stern in very, very high wind speeds. It's the bow that tends to be lost first, because the thrusters will be overcome by the wind force before the huge power of the azipods at the stern are. Therefore, a lot of cruise ship captains that have azipoded ships will order just a single tug. And this is where it becomes important. If you as a pilot are boarding a cruise ship with an azipod coming in a high wind speed, the captain informs you he's ordered a tug, and the tug that calls you up to come towards you, or the tug that the harbour master advises you've got, is an azimuth stern drive tug, then you may have an issue, because you're always going to put that tug up forward, because the bow thrusters are going to be overcome first. So if you're giving an azimuth stern drive tug, you may have a bit of an issue making that tug fast. Azimuthing stern drive tugs can still go up forward, they can still make fast by going astern, but they would expect the speed of the ship to be a lot lower in order for them to achieve this. And the trouble with berthing cruise ships in high winds is that because of their high sides, they have a hell of a lot of leeway. So when coming into the port and going through the port, you really do try and keep the speed up so that that leeway is minimised. Otherwise, you'd be almost going sideways through the port and having a swept path so big that it could be dangerous by getting close to channel edges and buoys, etc. So if you are offered an azimuth stern drive tug on a podded cruise ship, you'll generally request that the tug be changed for either a tractor tug or a reverse stern drive tug, so you can use that tug effectively up forward to help when the bow thrusters are overcome by the force of the wind. Obviously, when we're using tugs in heavy weather, we do have some issues with tugs that we wouldn't have in normal conditions. There's always that constant risk of lines parting in heavy weather. We're using the tugs with very, very high power, and problems with lines can manifest themselves during these operations. We can have tugs that have trouble with the wash of ships if the wind speed is up. This is because the ship itself is putting a lot of revolutions through the propeller in order to maintain steerage in high winds, and some tugs at the back really do feel it if they're manoeuvring too close to the wash of the ship, and this can cause problems in the propulsion of the tug, and in extreme cases can even cause the tug's main engines to fail. Another issue with tugs, and particularly in heavy weather, is short lines. So if you're manoeuvring in heavy weather, you may have positioned the ship a lot closer to a danger than you perhaps would have been able to do in lighter winds. This means that the tug itself has to operate on a much shorter line. And the trouble with a tug operating on a much shorter line, and it doesn't matter what type of tug you're talking about here, is that the wash from the tug will always blast against the side of the ship. When we're using the tug on a line to pull on that line, the tug's wash is always going to be towards the ship. If the tug's line is short, there are two issues with that. One, all the power that the tug's putting on, if the line is too short, then the angle up to the ship is too great, and a lot of that power is lost in vertical force and not applied to the horizontal force that's going to be the most effective in manoeuvring the ship. The other problem with shorter lines, as I say, the wash of the tug goes directly against the hull of the ship, and therefore the pull on the line can, if you like, the effect be lessened because the wash of the tug is blasting against the side of the ship, which is countering the force that's being put on the line. Tug skippers will always try to put out sufficient line to be able to handle ships in normal conditions. It's just that if you need to manoeuvre a ship in high winds, as I say, you may find yourself in a position where you've had to come in closer to an object to allow for that leeway of the ship, and therefore the tug has to reduce its line, And as I say, this can cause issues. Regardless of the type of tug, regardless of the power of the tug, how you're using the tug, we have to take our hats off to the guys that are driving these tugs. Very highly skilled individuals that are able to manoeuvre these tugs to the commands of the pilot. And sometimes, particularly in high winds, those commands can change very, very quickly as you adjust to large gusts or changes in wind direction associated with poor weather conditions. This is where the more manoeuvrable tugs, such as the tractor tugs or the reverse stern drive tugs, really do come into their own, in that they're able to put a lot of power on the line, yet at the same time, unlike conventional propeller tugs, they've got the grunt, but they've also got the finesse. That having been said, it takes a skillful hand to ensure that the huge amounts of power that these tugs are able to put down, one, is put down in an appropriate way. Two, the power is put down in a direction and effect that the pilot needs. And three, the tug itself is handled in such a way that it's able to be in the right position at the right time in order to effect an order from a pilot, which may have come all of a sudden in response to a particularly nasty gust or in response to the ship doing something that the pilot didn't expect it to do when manoeuvring ships in heavy weather. That's a very, very broad brush of towage and the use of tugs and some of the things to look out for when you've got a tug coming towards you. Final thought for this podcast is that if you are offered tugs, take tugs. Yeah. Nobody should be in a position where if a tug is coming towards them because the tug has been ordered either by the master or the owner, if the tug is there, use the tug. There have been incidents in the past where tugs have been available, tugs have been booked, but they have not been used by ships, and the ship has ultimately found itself in a bit of grief. Earlier on this year, in 2025, we had Storm Eowyn come through, and we had a ship called the Busan Express arriving at the port of Southampton just before Storm Eowyn came through. Storm Eowyn was a nasty one. You may remember that there were some very high wind speeds associated with that storm as it came across the UK. January of this year, January 2025. The Busan Express was due to come in before the storm came through, but only just before the storm came through. I was one of the pilots on the ship, and we were discussing what measures to put in place to berth the ship safely before the storm took hold. Weather forecasting by its sheer nature isn't exactly going to be exact, and therefore we needed to take that into account. The ship was scheduled to have 4 tugs for its arrival. I suggested that because of the wind forecast and the window that we had, that we increase that to 5 tugs. Not many ships in the port of Southampton that have berthed with 5 tugs. And I'll always remember having a discussion with the master of the ship when we were talking about the potential for the wind speeds to be very, very high. The wind direction was favourable, but nonetheless, the potential for the wind speed to be very, very high. And when I said to him, do you want to take a 5th tug, Captain, just as an extra precaution? He said to me, if you've got 5 tugs, Mr. Pilot, I will take 5 tugs. And that's because I'd offered him a tug. He's never going to turn around and say no, particularly in wind speeds that we were experiencing. If you've got a tug booked, if one's available, if one's coming your way, use that tug. That's my final thought for today. I hope you enjoyed this podcast on tugs and towage, and I look forward to welcoming you back soon on the next podcast on the Maritime Education Podcast. Thanks for listening, everyone. Have a great day.